So usually human dignity is rooted in someone's worth or value, and it's theorized as something that's given or taken away or something that we're always already born with. And my argument in the book is that it's something we practice.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences, with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff, with departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others. The college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
Christa Teston joins me today in the ASC Marketing and Communications Studio. She is the Andrea Lunsford Designated Professor of English, Vice Chair of Rhetoric, Composition, and Literacy Studies, and Director of Business and Technical Writing in the Department of English. Dr. Teston, welcome to Voices.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'd like to begin first with your most recent book as a way to sort of introduce us to your research, Doing Dignity, Ethical Praxis, and the Politics of Care. What are you arguing in this book?
Well, I'm arguing for an undoing of centuries worth of postulation about what it means to do dignity or what dignity is. So usually human dignity is rooted in someone's worth or value, and it's theorized as something that's given or taken away or something that we're always already born with. And my argument in the book is that it's something we practice. And so it's a thing that, or a series of things, I call it a repertoire of practices that we enact in specific times and places in particular ways that hinge on whatever the situation is. So I'm a rhetorician, so I say dignity is rhetorical.
Say a little more about that, dignity as a rhetoric.
So for rhetoricians, we argue that meaning is never fixed. It's always kind of in flux and contingent on the nuances of a situation. So in cases where we're interested in exploring what dignity looks like or how to practice dignity, we have to be super attuned to the nuances of the situation. So one chapter is focused on, right at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, I did a series of interviews and focus groups with first responders around the country. And we talked a lot about what was dignified and undignified about their everyday practices with patients, especially right at the start of the pandemic when, if you remember, things like PPE, the masks and gloves and everything were in short supply. And so there were a lot of sort of homegrown tactics that healthcare professionals had to enact sort of in the moment that weren't officialized, weren't approved, weren't the kinds of things you learned in med school. And they were ways of trying to do dignity despite the sort of indignities of the moment. So the book tries to capture, and as much as I can through ethnographic and interview and observation, the various ways people sort of creatively deploy dignified care.
So dignity is not something inherent, it's something we practice.
That's what I argue.
Is this something that we learn? And if so, how do we learn dignity?
Yes, it is something that we learn. But unfortunately, we are always one step behind making sense of what was or wasn't dignified. And so we have to kind of curate, and in the book I say reflexively sort of reflect on what happened and why and what the outcome was, and then sort of over time curate this repertoire of practices that we can sort of draw on depending on what the situation is. So it is something that you can sort of teach, especially in medical schools. They do try to teach things and practices and techniques that are standardized and can be extrapolated across populations no matter what. But there are nuances that people have to sort of inventively deploy in the moment that I think you only learn through practice. So actually one of the things that I do study is simulations, healthcare simulations. So how people practice working with certain populations that might be, we could say, precarious, which simply means they, for one reason or another, are treated as less than by the larger system. Maybe they're drug users or disabled or a minoritized population. And so sometimes in healthcare simulations, they'll set up these scenarios where people have to practice what it's like to work with folks like that. And the assumption built into some of these simulations is that the future healthcare professional is not themselves a member of that precarious population, which is a faulty assumption a lot. So I study how people do learn how to deploy dignified care over time and in particular spaces.
Are the examples in this book all drawn from healthcare, or?
They are. So the one example I already gave was from COVID-19. I have a whole chapter devoted to studying people's wheelchair fitting sessions over at Martha Morehouse. I observed how people who are newly disabled are fitted for a wheelchair, and the very hours and hours of iterative tinkering with a chair and how it fits a person's body depending on how they sit, or how they hunch, or how they wheel themselves in the chair. And so I sort of curate this long list of techniques that I say that physical therapists are using in order to do dignity. That's one chapter. And then the last chapter that I haven't mentioned yet is focused on medical aid in dying legislation. Some people refer to it as death with dignity, assisted suicide, more colloquially known as euthanasia. I studied in that chapter how people testified either for or against the legislation in the United States. So I analyzed their discourse and how they talked about what it meant to do dignity at the end of life.
What did you uncover?
I uncovered that people are inherently, whether they know it or not, what we would say compulsorily able-bodied, which basically means that no matter how well-intentioned you are, there is a stigma around things like not being able to control your bladder or your bowels at the end of life, or not being able to walk, or not being able to, see grandkids at their soccer games. There's a lot of lore built up into what that means for somebody and their quality of life, and so those stories came to fore quite a bit in testimony among people who testified for or against medical aid in dying.
Your first book was called Bodies in Flux, Scientific Methods for Negotiating Medical Uncertainty. Could you tell us what you argued in this book?
Sure. So this is sort of a precursor to doing dignity, and that is, holy cow, everything is really uncertain. We think we know things, and we think we have a handle on things, and we do. We're pretty smart as physicians or scientists, but there's a lot out there that we don't know. And so I studied how people try to make sense of the sort of amassing of evidence and uncertainties and decision-making. And so each chapter sort of zooms in on one technique for making sense of uncertainty in medical or scientific situations.
Tell us about some of these chapters.
Well, one whole chapter zooms in on how people use statistics to make inferences about what the best next step is. So there's a kind of rhetoric called deliberative rhetoric, which is basically where we're focused on what to do about the future. So Aristotle says there's epideictic rhetoric, which is praise or blame, which is the thing you do at like a funeral oration. So praise or blame is one form of rhetoric. Forensic rhetoric is like trying to decide, did a thing happen in the past? So that's courtroom stuff. And then I studied deliberative rhetoric, which is what we do in the future. So each of these chapters zooms in on techniques for sort of constructing uncertainty from the body. So whether it's taking cells from a tumor and making those cells interact with particular dyes such that the dye reveals the kind of cancer it is. So I'm pretty much trying to do what rhetoricians would call making the familiar strange. So you take this thing that you think you know, such as, dying cells, and trying to reveal what stage a cancer is. But if you look at it anew from a non-expert's eyes, and you sort of wonder about it and ask questions about how we got here and how we knew to do that thing, it opens what Bruno Latour would call the black box. The black box is a thing we build, supposedly in techno-scientific situations, to make sense of the world that simplifies things. And it doesn't do it in a way that's nefarious or bad, but we have to have black boxes, like your cell phone. You don't need to know how each button works when you press it. In fact, if you thought about that every time, it would be overwhelming. So the cell phone encapsulates a series of black boxes, and it's the same with health and medicine. It's made up and built out of a series series of black boxes. So Bodies in Flux tries to open up those black boxes one at a time through each chapter.
So 2 books that deal broadly with healthcare. Why the focus on healthcare?
My mom had 3 kids, I'm the oldest, and decided to go to medical school.
Oh.
And my dad was a minister. So dinner conversations were very rich and oftentimes about God, our bodies, and how humans try to figure out where our agency is within that sort of equation of God and the body and the world. So I think I kind of got used to having conversations about not knowing what the future holds, hoping that there is some sort of grand design or plan, but also knowing that there was no guarantee of such a thing, and so we need to do our best to figure it out on our own in the meantime.
But you didn't go to medical school.
No. I kind of kicked myself for that. No, I watched my mom go through that firsthand, and it just seemed so daunting and honestly depressing. And I've watched her retire early from it. She was an oncologist. She worked with cancer patients. And it's just as laden with bureaucracy and demoralizing workplace practices as any other profession. So any sort of high hope I had that it was like saving the world or helping people, I don't know. I feel like that gets outweighed by a lot of the bureaucracy that she deals with.
And I want to come back to that question in a moment, but the approach that you take in these 2 books, before we started recording, you said, unlike a lot of your colleagues in English studies, you work in empirical research with human subjects.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about this method, its distinctions, say, from other rhetoricians.
Sure. So human subjects is just the fancy word that the IRB, or Institutional Review Board, uses here at Ohio State and across the country. So I would prefer the word participants, human participants. But a lot of folks in rhetoric study texts, and I study texts too. There's a colleague who published about this and said that only studying texts is like trying to understand what went on at a party after everyone's gone home. And you just show up and sort of analyze where the napkins are and where the food is and what's in the trash. And so I try to understand the situation by showing up at the party, being present with people. And this is what empiricism is, right? Like being able to, through multiple senses, apprehend a version of reality that you can document and share with others. So I try to do what's called triangulation, where I put analysis of texts in conversation with 2 other data points. And usually those 2 other data points for me are something like surveys, qualitative surveys, interviews, focus groups, observations, so that I can have at least 3 different data points around which I can sort of make claims or build some theories.
You mentioned ethnographic research, for instance. What does that look like?
So that's literally, earlier I mentioned about the wheelchair fitting clinic that I observed. That's where you show up over time, every day or every week for a certain number of hours, and you just record everything you see. And you start to, over time, get to know the thing that you're observing, and you start to build some patterns and some theories about what's going on. And you get a chance to, again, make the familiar strange, where this thing that you thought of was just this kind of rote, quotidian, or everyday practice is actually quite brilliant and rich with dignified care. So I actually had to present my research from the wheelchair fitting clinic to the physical therapists that I observed. And they were, I think, pleasantly surprised that I was framing what they were doing as dignity, because they had never thought of it in that way. It was so everyday for them.
Well, you just answered, at least partially, my next question. I mean, there's obviously value in what you're doing. Is there practical use, for instance, on medical practice? Is this book being read just by rhetoricians or in the medical field? Are they reading this and having their practices impacted?
Ooh, I hope so. That would be a goal. Now, it just came out in 2024. It did come out with Johns Hopkins, which is a good press to, I think, make those connections with folks in healthcare and medicine. I probably need to be more proactive about making connections with folks, in other disciplines. And I do that here at Ohio State, but I'm not sure that I'm as good at it nationwide. I did just get invited by Ion magazine, AEON, to write an essay for them on dignity. And they told me they had something like, I don't remember how many thousands of readers. So maybe one strategy will be to put things out in popular press that distills some of the key insights from the project so that it's not just talking to rhetoricians, but to the general public writ large. So at this point, I can't say definitively that it's had an impact, but I do. When I work with doctoral students, they oftentimes are doing work in healthcare settings, and they are very much interested in improving curriculum, improving patient care. And so I think probably the impact happens through pedagogy more than...
Well, and you had said earlier that it was a goal. When you set out to write these books, was that an explicit goal?
Yeah, I think so. I think from watching my mom do what she does, I've watched the way the institutional spaces hamper dignified care. And so I'm interested in sort of cataloging in ways that might be obvious to most folks, but cataloging them empirically, all the ways that the institution can make it difficult to do dignity, in the hope that people might have their feelers out for when those things emerge and they can find creative ways to sort of hack the situation and do dignity despite the institutional or bureaucratic hurdles.
What is felt sense? This is an important part of your work. What is this idea, this concept?
So felt sense comes from, in writing studies, which is one of my sister disciplines, Sandra Pearl studies how people learn how to write through their bodies, that it's oftentimes a kind of intuitive, pre-linguistic, that is, we don't necessarily have the words yet to describe the thing that makes us want to say or do things in certain ways. And so I argue that the same thing is going on in healthcare contexts, and when we're faced with immense and overwhelming uncertainties, that oftentimes we're kind of following hunches. We have preconceived notions to think or believe a certain thing. Now, the problem with studying felt sense is that they are, as Michael Polanyi would say, tacit. So they're pre-linguistic. There are these things that we can't really describe yet. For example, do you drive a stick shift car, or have you ever driven a stick shift?
I have never, ever learned how to do that.
Oh, that's so I have to stop giving this example in class, too, because students haven't either. But there is that moment. You know about the clutch, right?
I do,
you let
yes.
the clutch out, and if you do...
Part of the reason why I've never learned how to drive a stick shift.
So if you let the clutch out too soon, it stalls out. And so there's this sort of art to knowing when to press the gas in and let the clutch out. And that is it's so felt. And you probably go through the day not even realizing how much you rely on your felt sense. So I'm interested in, again, making that familiar strange, drawing attention to it, perhaps asking people to talk their way through their felt sense so they can start putting words to some of that. And I think it's there that we can tap into whether or not people are actually doing dignity or doing care in the ways that they intended, without questioning or reflecting on the ways tacit knowledge or felt sense affects our practices. I think it's a lost opportunity for critiquing our own ways of getting through the world and doing life.
I introduced you as Director of Business and Technical Writing for the Department of English. And I don't know if I'm putting you on the spot with this or not, but of course we're living in a moment, at least for the last 2 years, where large language models are now consumer grade. What is going to be the impact of large language models on business and technical writing? And is that going to change your practices as someone who teaches this?
Yeah.
Are we still going to teach business and technical writing in the future?
Yeah. I think we will still teach business and technical writing. I think that we have to shift away from maybe some of the outdated modes of teaching business and technical writing, which is rooted in perhaps only focusing on textual expression. I think a lot of the writing that happens in the workplace now is multimodal, which basically means it's text, it's visual, there's even gestural if you're doing presentations. And so those should make up the crux of our pedagogical tactics. How to teach visualizing qualitative or quantitative information. How do we distill that in a graph? I've tried to use, ChatGPT and other LLMs to produce visual representations, and they're really bad at it at this point. They might get better. They likely will get better. I think it takes great skill to put multiple modes together into one document or one sort of communicative endeavor, and I'm not so sure that that can be done by anyone other than a human at this point. I do think that, to get back to felt sense, I actually am studying now with Elizabeth Velasquez, a graduate student here in English. She and I are studying how people decide whether what they're reading has been produced by a human or AI.
Say a little more about that.
So we give them little abstracts, scientific abstracts of articles, one of which has been written by a human, one of which has been written by AI. We don't tell them which one is which, and we ask them to talk through why they think one has been written by AI or a human. And what we revealed in the study is that people are relying on felt sense. So they'll have these words that they'll see in the text, like delves. Everybody thinks delves is AI now.
Is that true?
I don't know.
Oh.
I think that someone has recently published about that in the popular press. Everybody has read that article, and then they're bringing it with them when they're reading student texts in the English department, for example. So that's part of felt sense, is this prior knowledge or things that they've sort of consumed outside of that situation that have sort of lodged themselves in their psyche or body of knowledge that they then bring to bear on future practices. So yeah, we try to catalog the various kinds and forms of felt sense that people are relying on when they encounter texts, now that AI is a part of the literate landscape.
Are people pretty good at distinguishing what's been written by an AI, what's been written by a human?
When you give them one AI, one human, and one co-written AI plus human, they're bad at it.
Really?
When you give them one AI and one human and you tell them it's 50-50, in other words, they don't think that it's possibly two AIs, by process of elimination, they're good at it.
What explains that?
I don't know. I don't think we know. And I think the fact that so much of it is co-written today means that it's pretty impossible to, without a doubt, know that something has been produced by AI or human.
I was part of an experiment, I guess. The local theater, Mad Lab, back in March, it was the same prompt to ChatGPT and to a human playwright to write a 30-minute play. And we asked the audience which was written by which. And about 75% of the audience gets it right, absolutely gets it right. And we tried to figure out, so how did you know? How were you able to figure this out so quickly? And it had to do with things like repetition.
Right.
AI was, tended to repeat the same, in some cases, the same lines. But it also had to do with things like humor. One of the things I argued was allusion. The human was making, I won't spoil it, a Seinfeld reference. That to me was a tell that was written by a human being.
Yes.
Say a little more about what co-writing is.
So it's where we actually took a human-authored abstract, put it into ChatGPT or Gemini, asked it to rewrite it, and then we added a human component. We edited it with a human. So we called that co-written. And that is how we're seeing what students are submitting, where it's not just 100% AI most of the time. The difficult cases to quote-unquote detect, if you're interested in detecting, are ones where folks are blending their own prose with what ChatGPT is giving us.
You maybe have given away your answer to this. Are those students cheating in your mind?
Now, it depends on what the instructor has told them they're allowed to do. That's my final answer, I guess. But no, I think that we need to reckon with the fact that it's probably not going away. Now, I respect there are quite a few folks in the field of rhetoric who are part of a cohort where they are resisting AI. They're rightfully pointing out the environmental costs, the economic costs. I don't know where that will go. I don't know that will have an effect on practice. And so
what we want, or what rhetoricians want.
Right, or what students want. I think what students want is to know how to use AI in ways that work best for them in their future. Most of the time, students don't want to cheat. They literally do want to become better writers. So I think it's our job to help them do that. And so in my business writing class, I actually give them a list of here's how you can use Copilot, because of course we can only use Microsoft Copilot here
at
at
Ohio
OC.
State, yes.
Here's how you can use Copilot for writing project number 1. Here's how you can't use Copilot. Here's what you could use Copilot for, but it isn't so great at right now. So I hope that just by having that sort of open and honest conversation with students, it becomes less about cheating and trying to get away with something and more about what are the affordances and the constraints of this tool and how can we leverage it in ways that are ethical.
My question is, we have our rules as academics. Here's what you can and can't do.
Yeah.
Will those be the same rules that they're going to encounter when they're out in the real world?
No, it depends upon where they're working. So some places, the information that they would plug into Copilot would be proprietary. And so you'd be breaking rules internally with the company in that way. So again, it's way more complex than use it or not use it. It's really about getting to know the culture, the boundaries, the expectations of the audiences and the people that you're writing with or for. And that's rhetoric.
So earlier I asked you why you didn't go to medical school. Why did you end up as a rhetorician then?
I had to take a rhetoric class to get my master's degree in literature at Kent State University. It was a requirement. And we read a book called The World on Paper. And I had no idea that you could do that work, where you could study how the world is constructed through writing and through communicative methods. I thought you could only study writing that already existed, that we sort of lauded as being exemplary. I didn't know that you could study everyday people's writing and find it fascinating and revealing about who we are. So the person who taught that class, Dr. Christina Haas, I asked her if she thought I should check out a PhD. She said yes, wrote me a letter of recommendation. And the rest is history. She became my dissertation director. So really, it's a person. It's a person who ushered me into the field.
But you were there studying literature
I was.
initially.
Yeah, I was going to be a Chaucerian.
Why?
I don't know.
I mean, what I mean by that is, why Chaucer as opposed to, I don't know, Milton or Shakespeare? Why Chaucer?
Susanna Fine was a fabulous instructor at Kent State University. I loved her classes. I did well on the papers. I wasn't passionate about it, but it seemed like a thing I was good at, and so I was drawn to it, I guess, in that way.
And then the connection to medicine or healthcare came during the dissertation stage?
Yeah, so The World on Paper got me thinking about patient charts and how patienthood is constructed through what's written in a chart and how that can kind of make or break a patient-doctor relationship and, in effect, make or break somebody's diagnosis and future health.
Tell us what's next for your research.
I have this great reader experience lab over in Denny Hall. There's not a lot of great things in Denny Hall, I'll tell you, outside of the people who are there. But I have a reader experience lab, which the funds for that was provided from our dean, our amazing dean. And she gave us the funds to create a lab that has 2 spaces. It's divided by a one-way glass mirror. So you can observe people in another room without them seeing you observing them. I also have eye tracking software set up in the space that allows me to see where people are looking on a screen or on a brochure or on a page to understand kind of how they are processing information when they're reading. So I'm interested in uncovering how people are making sense of uncertainty through texts in ways that they might not know themselves. So I'm interested in collecting data about people's felt sense, their sort of impulse or intuition about what it is they're reading, what they should skip over, what they think is more interesting or relevant for their project. And that's what the Reader Experience Lab is set up to do, is to collect those kind of data.
Any particular kinds of reader experiences you're interested in at this stage?
Well, this is where we did the AI trigger test, where we gave people those 3 abstracts and asked them to discern whether or not it had been written by AI. We're also interested in taking some assumptions about how people read, especially able-bodied readers, taking those able-bodied assumptions and seeing how they stack up with neurodiverse readers or folks who are disabled, and trying to sort of write new rules that aren't as contingent on just able-bodied readers.
Christa Teston, thank you.
Thank you.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at the Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dangler. I'm Jen Farmer.